Nintendo 64. When I think of indirectly nostalgic consoles, this is the one that immediately comes to mind. However, does said nostalgia inherently make the console and its library of software any good? Well, let's find out, but before that I feel I should talk about my own experience with the console itself. Despite what some of you may think, when I was a little kid I did not have a lot of video games. Heck, for a long time I didn't have any. I was the firstborn child in my immediate family, so I didn't inherit any from any older siblings, nor did I from my parents. My father had an intense passion for sports, and my mother obsessed over Disney movies. And out of the two, I clearly inherited the latter. The bells of Notre Dame. You sound like... However, through the means of television and friends, I became very aware of the Nintendo 64 versus PlayStation war that was going on at the time. Remember that Got Milk commercial with Mario, the Taco Bell Mario Kart 64 promotion, and the Crash Bandicoot Pizza Hut commercials? Yeah, those were how I was introduced to those characters and their games respectively. Then I went to my uncle's house for some family gathering and got to play the Nintendo 64 for the first time. I played a number of games, including 1080 Degree Snowboarding, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Mario Kart 64, and Star Wars Rogue Squadron. After that encounter, I desperately wanted a Nintendo 64 and begged my parents endlessly for one. And I didn't get one. I did get a GameCube a few years later, but no N64, and I didn't get all that much exposure since then. Sometimes I would get to play Star Fox 64, but otherwise I didn't play it all that much. However, I glorified the system to no end as a kid, and especially as a preteen, often dismissing the games I had on the GameCube as inferior by default. Then, one fateful day in middle school, I bought the system for myself through Amazon. It was the first console I paid for with my own money. The first in several. So what did I think of it, and what do I think of it now? Well, both questions lead to the same answer, and I'll answer it later in this video. First, let's go over the system itself. I simply adore the design of this thing. It's very pleasing to the eye, and is also very functional. It shares the same AV cable as the Super Nintendo and GameCube, making switching consoles a breeze. Now let's talk about the AC adapter. Most AC adapters have a box either at the end where you plug it into the wall, or halfway through the cord. The Nintendo 64's AC adapter is different, however, as the box is on the end where you plug it into the console. Aside from the AV and AC ports, the console itself has 4 controller ports, a cartridge slot, and a memory expansion port, which I'll talk about in a bit. Another thing that's a little unconventional is that the memory card slot is not on the console, it's on the controller, and what the heck is this? This right here is the Nintendo 64 controller, and what an oddity it is. It's such an oddity that the instruction manuals for the games have to tell you how to hold the dang thing. Most games have you hold the middle part of the controller with your left hand, so as a result the L button and arrow pad are hard to reach and have little to no use in most of these games. That's great controller design, right? Then there's the analog stick itself. This is one of the least comfortable to use analog sticks I've ever seen. It's stiff, it's awkward, and with certain games it'll even make your hands sore. There are a couple of games that manage to make it feel smooth and natural, but those aren't all that common. Believe it or not, I actually like the way the controller looks. I just don't like the way it functions. Now before I get into the library of games, let's go over the hardware. I'm not going to go into too many of the specifics, but the Nintendo 64 actually had some pretty good graphical capabilities for the time. The sound, on the other hand, is a little strange, hard to understand, and even harder to explain accurately. The Nintendo 64 actually doesn't have a sound card. And because it's so difficult to explain, I'm going to quote Factor 5 on how the Nintendo 64 sound worked. The Nintendo 64 shares its workload with the co-processor. Actually, let me rephrase that, the whole machine doesn't, because you could also make music with the CPU. It just seems that at the moment, most people are preoccupied with pumping out cool graphics, and that's also what most gamers want. And the more graphics you do on the Nintendo 64, the less performance you have left over for sound. With the Super Nintendo, you knew that you could do all of this, and then you still had a sound chip to handle the music. On the Nintendo 64, sound eats up the performance. Now with all of that said, the common format for Nintendo 64 music was modified MIDI music, but others like the songs in Top Gear Rally were probably made with a tracker program of some sort. However, even with all this talk of no sound card, some developers made their own sound drivers to bring out more impressive sound from the console, the most notable being Rare and Factor 5. In fact, Factor 5 developed their own voice compression technology first used with Star Wars Rogue Squadron. This allowed them to cram in 80 minutes of voice acting and sound effects into a 19 megabyte cartridge. After this, everyone started using it. Nintendo, Game Freak, Capcom, you name it. Speaking of the technological advancements brought with Rogue Squadron, that game pretty much marked the system's rebirth. Remember that memory expansion port I was talking about earlier? Yeah, it's time to talk about it. In 1998, Nintendo released a memory expansion pack that increased the system RAM from 4 megabytes to 8 megabytes. Turok 2 was the first game to use it to increase the system resolution from 320 by 240 to 640 by 480. Rogue Squadron then took it a step further and utilized microcode solutions to push the system beyond its limits, resulting in the game's stunning visuals for the time. After that point, games started looking better, sounding better, performing better, and getting bigger. Thus, what I like to call the Nintendo 64 Generation 2 begun. So if you consider getting the system, I think it's almost a requirement to get an expansion pack. Yes, you need to remove the jumper pack, and you probably won't get an expansion pack with the removal tool. However, a trusty knife will fix that. As one could tell, my thoughts on the console itself are generally pretty positive. But let's talk about the games. People go nuts for the Nintendo 64's library, and to be honest, this is where I found the system to be immensely underwhelming. To be honest, a good chunk of the most overrated games I've ever played are Nintendo 64 games. Games like Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, and especially The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, while good, just don't live up to their reputations. Mario Kart 64 is a really fun game, but it doesn't exactly do anything artistic on a game design level, and as a result pales in comparison to other racing games like Lotus Turbo Challenge 2. So when people say that Mario Kart 64 is the best racing game ever, especially without a supporting argument to go along with it, it just comes across as a bit ignorant. Star Fox 64, while a very nostalgic game for me, doesn't really do all that much either. It's just a rail shooter with a few little twists to keep things moderately interesting. It's not bad, but there isn't much to it, especially in comparison to some of the other games I've played, even on the same console. Ocarina of Time is good and has some pretty good atmosphere too, but it's not designed the best, or at the very least the most consistently, and otherwise just isn't an artistic marvel like, say, Turrican 2 and so on. But again, that doesn't mean it's bad, because it's not at all. It's good, just not that good. However, Super Mario 64, while not the first 3D platformer like everyone says it is, does deserve high recognition. While not one of my personal favorites, it is actually one of the best games I've played. But unfortunately, a lot of the Nintendo 64's exclusive library falls under the same label I just gave to most of the games I just listed. Good, but not especially impressive. A lot of the rare games are fun and clever, but aren't anything especially impressive on a game design level, at least not in my mind. I know these are really nostalgic games for a lot of people, but just because you're nostalgic about something doesn't mean it's the messiah of gaming. Jimmy Neutron for the GameCube is a nostalgic game for me, and objectively, I think it's horrible. It comes across at times that a lot of people are just de-evolving into that Nintendo 64 kid, but behaving like that every day of their lives, which is sad. Now, with the best gaming libraries, it's often a rewarding experience to venture into the unknown and see what you can find. This is not the case with the Nintendo 64. The guys at Nintendo purposely made the system hard to program for to scare away inexperienced and poor development studios. This backfired tremendously, so hard that they did the exact opposite with the GameCube. A lot of the third-party games are total crap. Once in a while, I'll find something worth playing, but a lot of the time I only find games I regret even bothering to play. So aside from the Nintendo and Rare games, there really isn't that much. However, I will say this. There are a couple of games that keep me coming back. One of which happens to be the best game I have ever played. Star Wars Rogue Squadron. Sure, it's not the most exciting and over-the-top game, but everything in the game does come together to make you feel like you're in Luke Skywalker's shoes. The graphics, the music, the implementation of the story, the game mechanics, the game design, the menus, everything, and I mean everything, contributes. Most importantly, everything is tied directly to the gameplay, which is very strategy-based. It's all about analyzing your surroundings and trying to find the most effective way to complete your objectives. So just by playing it alone, you're already immersed into the experience that a game has to offer. It's very much a strategy game mixed with an arcade game, mixed with a simulation game. And it works together so well. It's focused, it's smart, it's subtle, it's atmospheric, it's vast, it's intense, it's surprisingly intuitive for a Nintendo 64 flight game. It's just what I think of whenever I think of a nearly perfect game. If you like games that make you think and think a lot, then you will love it. So with that said, here are some of the Nintendo 64 games that I recommend trying out.
We can't get past the base shield. The base shield is down. We're beginning our attack. Did Skywalker make that shot? That was me. I thought I was the best. Hey! Okay, Rogues, we're not done here. Let's clean up the remaining Imperials and go home. Rogue Squadron, where's our cover?
Again, the library isn't bad. There are games worth playing, and those games are enough for me to keep the console. However, it's not enough to keep me coming back on a regular basis. I play my Nintendo 64 very infrequently, and most of the time I'm just playing Rogue Squadron again. There are some good games on the systems, some amazing ones actually, but if you're buying a Nintendo 64 expecting one of the greatest libraries in existence, then you're better off buying a Super Nintendo or a Commodore Amiga if you have the money. Because again, I just can't say the same thing I can with something like the Amiga, where I can recommend game after 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 game. So is the Nintendo 64 worth getting? I'd say yes, if you can find some games that you are actually really interested in. It's not too expensive to get either. However, a lot of the really popular ones you can find on other consoles too. So if you have a Wii with internet, a GameCube, or even a 3DS and only intend to play things like Super Mario 64, Star Fox 64, and Ocarina of Time, then I wouldn't recommend buying it unless you're really into those games hardcore. With that said, I cautiously recommend the Nintendo 64. It has its share of games. Just know what you're getting into.